For decades, we've been told that public health policies rest upon a solid foundation of impartial science. We are reassured by the academic achievements of esteemed professors, Nobel laureates, and established health agencies that claim to safeguard our well-being. Yet beneath this veneer of authority and expert consensus, a troubling reality has emerged. Many of these so-called elite academic circles have not only failed to protect the public, they have actively preserved a status quo aligned with corporate interests and entrenched bureaucratic power structures. Instead of championing cutting-edge research and advocating for policies that genuinely reflect the best interests of our families and communities, these influential academics appear locked in complacency, promoting outdated standards that overlook well-documented health risks. From vaccine safety controversies to archaic regulations on cell phone radiation, we see the fingerprints of compromised science. Nowhere is this dynamic more evident than in the mounting opposition by dozens of Nobel laureates to the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. By opposing a figure who challenges the system, these credentialed elites reveal their fundamental purpose: to preserve their power and protect a system that has repeatedly failed the American people. Confirming Kennedy would herald a much-needed disruption. As a longtime advocate for public health and environmental safety, Kennedy would demand transparency, updated regulations, and scientific inquiry untainted by corporate capture. The alarm bells have been ringing for decades about conflicts of interest, regulatory capture, and the slow erosion of trust in our institutions. Kennedy's leadership at HHS offers a critical opportunity to break this cycle, restoring faith in science by ensuring policies are guided by open debate, robust evidence, and genuine public interest. The time has come to confront the compromised academic establishment and move forward with leaders unafraid to challenge the narrative. Elite academics and the status quo, a legacy of failure. The crisis of public trust in science did not begin with COVID-19 or recent controversies. It dates back decades as credentialed experts, ostensibly neutral guardians of truth, enabled the corporate capture of regulatory bodies and stifled meaningful reform. Consider the glacial pace at which safety guidelines for cell phone radiation have evolved. The Federal Communications Commission, FCC, still relies on standards set in 1996, when cell phones were clunky devices rarely glued to users' bodies. These old guidelines focus solely on thermal heating effects of radio frequency, RF radiation, ignoring a growing body of literature that points to non-thermal biological effects, including DNA damage and possible cancer risks. If the academic establishment entrusted to inform policy with the latest findings had done its job, we would not still be stuck with these outdated standards. Instead, well-funded academics aligned with industry interests have contributed to a decades-long stalemate, where rigorous, independent research struggles to gain traction in policy decisions. The story is similar in the realm of vaccine safety debates and other areas of public health. The input of dissenting scientists or those who question long-standing assumptions is too often dismissed as anti-science, even when they bring legitimate concerns backed by evidence. This pattern is not accidental. It arises from an academic culture that rewards conformity, prioritizes funding streams over intellectual honesty, and too often prefers to silence challenges rather than engage openly. As a result, Americans have grown skeptical, and for good reason. The academic establishment's claim to authority rests on credentials and awards, like Nobel Prizes, rather than on their willingness to embrace new data and rectify misguided policies that endanger public health. A case in point, the wireless industry and regulatory capture. One of the clearest demonstrations of this captured system is the wireless industry's influence over EMF, electromagnetic field research, and cell phone radiation guidelines. Decades of research, including studies from the National Toxicology Program, NTP, and the Ramazzini Institute, have raised alarms about the non-thermal effects of RF radiation, risks that include DNA damage, oxidative stress, reproductive harm, and elevated cancer risks. Vulnerable populations, such as children, face heightened threats due to their developing tissues and thinner skulls, allowing radiation to penetrate more deeply. Yet the FCC, guided by outdated and industry-approved standards, refuses to update these guidelines. The reason? A captured system that places corporate profits over the public good. Elite academics who should be ringing alarm bells remain oddly quiet or even supportive of the status quo. They continue to cite old paradigms, dismissing non-thermal impacts despite the mounting scientific evidence. This is regulatory capture at its finest. Corporate interests guide policy, academic gatekeepers uphold the narrative, and federal agencies neglect their duty to protect the public. In a just system, the academic establishment would champion updated safety measures, encourage robust debate, and push for research free from industry influence. Instead, they help maintain a carefully orchestrated charade. The science, they insist, is settled, even as fresh data begs for re-examination. COVID-19 and the erosion of trust. The coronavirus pandemic laid bare how easily trust in the experts can be undermined. Conflicting guidance, shifting narratives, and the marginalization of alternative viewpoints caused many to question whether the public health establishment truly worked for their benefit. This crisis highlighted that credentialism itself is no guarantee of sound judgment. Elite academics were caught flat-footed on numerous occasions, whether it was the slow recognition of airborne transmission or the early dismissal of concerns that later proved valid. If these credentialed classes learned nothing from the public's growing disillusionment, it's that blind trust in expert consensus is waning. The public health establishment burned much of its credibility during COVID-19, mirroring a decline in trust that mainstream media suffered over the previous 2 decades. Yet, rather than undertaking a deep introspection and embracing greater transparency, many in the academic world have retreated further into credentialism, doubling down on their perceived infallibility. Nobel laureates versus Kennedy, defending the old guard. The recent letter signed by over 75 Nobel Prize winners urging the Senate not to confirm Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as HHS Secretary is a telling example of how the elite academic establishment reacts to perceived threats. Kennedy's critics highlight his supposed lack of credentials in medicine, science, or administration. They warn that placing him in charge of HHS, an agency overseeing the Food and Drug Administration, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and National Institutes of Health, would put public health at risk. But consider what these laureates represent: a class that has been deeply intertwined with existing power structures, funding streams, and policy frameworks for decades. Their intervention is unprecedented. Rarely do Nobel laureates band together against a cabinet choice. Their collective move signals fear that someone outside their club, who questions long-standing assumptions and industry-friendly policies, might shake up the carefully maintained balance of power. Kennedy, who has long raised questions about vaccine safety, the fluoridation of drinking water, and the trustworthiness of agencies captured by industry influence, represents the antithesis of the Nobel laureate's stance. Instead of revering established authorities and outdated guidelines, he calls for rigorous, independent research and policies that genuinely reflect modern science and public interest. The Nobel signatories claim they are protecting public health. But are they protecting it, or are they protecting their legacy and the system that elevated them? Elevating Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to HHS Secretary would mark a turning point. Kennedy has challenged the entrenched interests that keep federal guidelines hopelessly outdated. He has pushed for the reopening of NTP research into RF radiation's health impacts, called for acknowledging non-thermal risks in wireless technology, and advocated for transparency and accountability. What does this look like in practice? Updated regulations. The FCC's stance on cell phone radiation exemplifies the need for a shakeup. Modernizing safety standards to reflect current scientific understanding of EMF exposure would finally address the evidence that non-thermal biological effects are real and significant. Kennedy could urge swift action, compelling the FCC to establish stricter regulations, broaden research priorities, and require safer technology designs. Restarting independent research. the NTP cancer research into RF radiation was halted despite finding worrisome links, confirming Kennedy could reinvigorate long-stalled initiatives to assess long-term health impacts, ensuring we base policies on comprehensive, unbiased data, prioritizing science over profit. One cannot ignore the revolving door between industry leaders and federal agencies. Under Kennedy's guidance, HHS could advocate stronger conflict of interest rules and reinforce the importance of independence in federal research. By restoring scientific integrity, we could end the era of rubber-stamping industry-friendly guidelines that disregard potential health hazards. Community empowerment. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 severely limited local communities' say in cell tower placements and other technological deployments. Reopening discussions on this legislation could restore local rights and ensure that communities, not distant corporate boardrooms, decide what risks they are willing to tolerate. With Kennedy at HHS, these community voices might finally find a champion at the federal level. Transparent communication. Federal health agencies must communicate risks openly and honestly, acknowledging uncertainties and seeking broader input. A Kennedy-led HHS could set a new standard for public transparency, drawing on diverse research and encouraging public debate rather than stifling it. Credentialism versus critical inquiry. Who decides what is good science? This struggle is fundamentally about the nature of science itself. Established experts maintain that they guard a robust body of evidence. Critics argue these same experts can suffer from groupthink, conflicts of interest, or simply a reluctance to move beyond outdated paradigms. The COVID-19 saga and the wireless radiation controversy both highlight how credentialed scientists can dismiss important lines of inquiry and silence dissenting voices, even when those voices raise legitimate concerns. Good science thrives on critical inquiry, debate, and the willingness to correct course in the face of new data. When academic leaders circle the wagons, defend outdated guidelines, and paint critics as anti-science, they do a disservice to the scientific method. They also erode public trust, an essential ingredient for implementing sound public health policies. Kennedy, despite what his detractors claim, is advocating not for a rejection of science, but for a more honest, transparent, and accountable version of it. He asks, what if the so-called consensus is incomplete or compromised? This question does not undermine science, it reinvigorates it. True science welcomes skepticism, embraces updated evidence, and fosters progress. Real-world consequences, health, children, and the future. At the heart of these debates are real people, our families, neighbors, and especially children. Suppose we continue to ignore concerns about EMF radiation or fail to rigorously examine vaccine safety. In that case, we risk perpetuating policies that could harm vulnerable populations. Children with thinner skulls and developing brains are at greater risk from RF radiation. Yet institutions have failed to reflect this in safety guidelines. Instead, they hew to old standards that do not address the unique vulnerabilities of young populations. Similarly, if public health agencies become echo chambers that resist critical examination of their stances on vaccines, we run the risk of breeding even greater skepticism. Overly simplistic narratives that claim absolute safety, or conversely dismiss all hesitation as conspiracy, feed polarization and reduce the quality of public discourse. A leader like Kennedy, willing to ask hard questions and demand evidence-based answers, could help establish nuanced policies that rebuild trust rather than tear it down. The question isn't whether science can provide solutions, it's whether we have allowed certain gatekeepers to restrict the kind of questions we ask. By confirming Kennedy, we empower a reformer who understands that protecting public health sometimes means challenging the comfort of established elites who profit from business as usual. Take action, demand accountability from your elected officials. If you share these concerns, this is not the time for passive lamentation. We stand at a critical juncture. Urge your senators and representatives to confirm Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for HHS. Let them know that a failure to place authentic public servants who prioritize health over profit at the helm of federal agencies will have electoral consequences. Politicians respond to pressure from constituents, and a groundswell of support for leaders who value transparency and accountability could finally tip the balance. Call your elected officials, write letters, share credible information on the non-thermal biological effects of RF radiation and the need to revisit outdated guidelines. Demand that they restore the National Toxicology Program's investigations and ensure that regulatory agencies like the FCC answer to the public, not corporate boardrooms. When voters become informed and active, entrenched interests lose their grip. RF Safe, a case study in advocacy for safer technology. Organizations like RF Safe have been sounding the alarm since the 1990s, advocating for updated safety guidelines and non-thermal risk recognition. They highlight the clear evidence non-thermal biological effects of EMR are real, and action is urgently needed. By embracing modern science and enforcing stricter regulations, we can spur the development of safer technology. RF Safe's goals align closely with Kennedy's vision. Update FCC safety guidelines. Reflect today's scientific understanding. Restart NTP cancer research. Don't suppress critical research findings. End FCC regulatory capture. Put public health, not corporate profit, at the center of policy decisions. These steps matter because they reflect a path forward, a future where policy is driven by data and public interest rather than industry lobbying and academic complicity. They show that what we need is not just a superficial shakeup, but a deep reevaluation of how we produce, fund, and interpret scientific research. The larger lesson: science, power, and public interest. This debate over Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination symbolizes a larger struggle, deciding who gets to define good science. The entrenched academic establishment clings to the notion that they alone set the terms of debate. Yet their track record, particularly on emerging public health threats and regulatory capture, tells a different story. We must confront the reality that science does not exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by social, political, and economic forces. When corporate interests and protective elites occupy gatekeeper positions, they can steer scientific research and policy to benefit themselves rather than the public. This is precisely why disruptive leadership is needed, to break through these barriers, reassert the value of open inquiry, and ensure that public health policies serve the people. Kennedy's appointment would not be a cure-all. Genuine reform demands a long-term commitment to transparency, credible research, and public involvement. But confirming Kennedy would signal that we value independent thinkers who question outdated assumptions. It would remind the credentialed class that their authority is contingent on serving the public interest, not on preserving their comfort and prestige. A call for courage and change. For too long, entrenched elites have dominated the narrative, claiming their credentials and prizes as proof of righteousness. They have defended outdated guidelines, supported flawed policies, and attacked those who dare ask uncomfortable questions. Meanwhile, Americans grow ever more skeptical, witnessing how regulations fail to evolve even as evidence accumulates. The opposition to Kennedy's nomination by Nobel laureates and established academics illustrates the system's desperation to preserve itself. But if these academics had truly upheld science's noble ideals, they would welcome debate, modernize guidelines, and eagerly pursue independent research. Instead, they cling to authority and familiarity, framing challengers as threats rather than agents of progress. Kennedy's stance as a necessary disruptor can break through this logjam. By pushing for transparency, updated regulations, and honest inquiry, he embodies the qualities of leadership we desperately need. The public's health should come before profit, and evidence-based policy should eclipse corporate-driven pseudo-consensus. It's time to contact your elected officials and demand that they confirm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., or face the electoral consequences of ignoring the public's call for genuine reform. Only by empowering disruptors who value truth over power can we restore trust in science and ensure a healthier, safer future for all Americans. Visit RF Safe to learn more.